Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Timothy Ford as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce our guest for today's episode. Dr. Timothy Ford is a prominent American academic specializing in business ethics and law, currently serving as the Eveleigh Professor of Business Ethics at Indiana University's Kelley School of Business. A 2024 Nobel Peace Prize nominee, he is recognized for his research on how ethical corporate culture and business practices can foster peace and manage conflicts. He is also an affiliated faculty member at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, University of Notre Dame. In recognition of his influence scholarship, Professor Ford received the Distinguished Career Faculty Award of the Academy of Legal Studies in Business in 2020. Author of over 100 scholarly articles, book chapters, and reviews, Dr. Ford has written 12 books and edited 25 more, including two that earned the Best Book Award from the Academy of Management's Social Issues Division. His exceptional contributions have been recognized with 12 research awards across three leading academic associations: the Academy of Legal Studies in Business, the Society for Business Ethics, and the Academy of Management. As an educator, he has received five teaching awards, co-taught with former Federal Reserve Bank Ben Bernanke, and lead a pioneering academic program for National Football League players. Professor Ford's research explores how ethical business practices cultivate positive organizational culture that advance sustainable peace. He has worked with the U.S. Institute of Peace, U.S. State Department, and non-profit organizations such as International Peace Through Tourism and Peace Through Commerce, developing initiatives that connect business ethics with global peace building. Expanding these explorations into culture, he created the concept of cultural foundations of peace, examining how music, sports, and film can help inspire ethical decision making and bridge social divides. In collaboration with faculty from Jacob School of Music, he has organized interdisciplinary conferences, co-edited a book, authored research articles, and curated a film series with IU Cinema. He is currently co-authoring a new book with Christine Hahn, executive producer of The Morning Show and co-owner of Eco Films alongside Jennifer Aniston. Dr. Ford's early scholarship centered on the idea of businesses as mediating institutions, integrating insights from natural law and bioanthropology to shape theories of corporate culture and ethical practices. A proud alumnus of the University of Notre Dame and Northwestern University, Dr. Ford previously taught at the University of Michigan and George Washington University before joining Indiana University. In today's episode, Professor Timothy Ford discusses key ideas from his acclaimed book, The Sincerity Edge: How Ethical Leaders Build Dynamic Businesses. The publication, co-authored with Alexandra Christina, Countess of Fredericksburg. The book was a finalist for the 2018 Sim Book Award presented by the Social Issues in Management Division of the Academy of Management. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Timothy Ford to the conversation. Professor Timothy, it's a distinguished privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Deepak. I'm delighted to be here and look forward to our conversation over the next hour.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, could you share how you and Alexandra Christina came to collaborate on this book and why that
Sure.
partnership was significant to its development?
Yeah, sure. So Countess Alexandra, and when we say she's the Countess of Friedrichsborg, that is in Denmark. And so she was appointed to the board of directors of a Swiss pharmaceutical, Ferring Pharmaceutical, which is a pretty neat company, frankly. And she was asked to chair the board of directors ethics committee. And so the board, in a very, very convoluted way, found me, reached out to me, and asked me if I could kind of be a consultant, a guide, a sounding board, something like that. And so she and I worked together in that relationship for about 5 or 6 years or so. And we really hit it off. I mean, it was a good relationship, and we worked together very well. We enjoyed working together, nearly all of it over the old mechanism of Skype. You remember Skype? Oh man, that was a nightmare. So half of our calls we'd have to do maybe three or four Skypes to be able to talk to each other because the call would drop and all. It was before Zoom. Anyway, we enjoyed working together, and we decided we'd start writing together. So we wrote a couple of books. And we decided to write this particular book that you're talking about. And I think that one of the real advantages, there are several real advantages of it. One is that, you had someone from two different continents. You had someone from Europe, you had someone from North America, you had someone who was in business. I mean, she was a board of directors of a pharmaceutical. So she was having to make or advise on and vote on difficult choices and things like that. While I'm an academic, and I think that there's kind of a balance there that you can have. I always laugh that she held my feet to the fire because academics can talk about anything forever, and she was like, Tim, what is the point here? And it was kind of fun. And then I think that having the gender, you had a man and a woman, and so we had different vantage points that I think it really helped the book. And I think that we really helped each other think through things, and it resulted in a book that I think is that I'm really proud of.
Professor described companies as a corporate citizens that must be true to their mission and principled in practice. What does good corporate citizens look like when tough trade-off and short-term pressures hit?
Yeah, I mean, this is a classic problem, and you're very right to raise it, kind of right off the bat, because, ethics professors can talk about all these wonderful things they're just great to do, but in the real world, you're going to have to make a lot of trade-offs, and things are not so simple. There is a lot of research out there that shows that if you just tell people to comply, if you just tell people to, they're going to make money for doing something, that it doesn't really motivate people all that much, that they want to have more reasons of why to be good in their lives, including in business. And so I think that what citizenship and sincerity do is it provides a value structure that doesn't solve the issue of the trade-off in citizenship, but holds them accountable too. And so when you come to the decisions that you have to make of what do we have to do right now, it's easy to sweep things under the rug if you and say that they don't matter, that the ethics don't matter. But if you hold them out there, most people are inspired enough about them that they really then think through new ways, new innovative ways, new creative ways that they might get the business job done with less of the negative things that they might have had otherwise. Whereas if you pay no attention to it at all, you can rationalize and justify about anything. So it doesn't eliminate tensions or it doesn't eliminate the hard choices, but I do think it makes it more holistic to be able to make decisions that way.
Professor, the model you present is designed to align legal compliance, social responsibility, and financial performance. Can you walk us through how sincerity helps bridge those three domains rather than pitting them against each other?
Yeah, this is a good follow-up because it's a direct, kind of, case in point here. So the model that I developed actually on this, and it is in the book, and I had developed it separately, and then we kind of built and expanded on it in the Sincerity Edge, is what I call total integrity management. So, I mean, years ago, I mean, it's kind of common now, but years ago, the quality management theorists really showed uncompetitive with respect to Japanese businesses. That if you want to achieve a quality product or service, that you can't just wait till the product or service is about to be sent out to the market, because then it's too late. If it passes quality inspection, great. But if it doesn't, you're in a dilemma. Do we ship out a defective product or do we swallow the cost of remanufacturing, neither of which are a good choice, which is why it's called a dilemma. And so they argued that you really need to infuse quality checks and quality arguments and quality principles throughout the manufacturing process in order to get a quality product and service. And I made the analogy to ethics as well. If the first time that you're asking an ethical question is, 40 years ago and you're Exxon Valdez and there's a bunch of oil in the water, it's too late. I mean, there's no good way to get it out of the water. You're in a dilemma. And so you really need to be thinking about how to prevent ethical issues from happening in the first place. Well, a way to do that is to build on what I call hard trust, real trust, and good trust. And basically means that you need to have a strong compliance system. You need to let people, I am a lawyer, and so I think that it's a good idea to let people know what the rules are, what the laws are, what the company policies are that you have to follow. I think that that is a good idea. But in addition to that, you need to give people incentives for doing what you say you want them to do. I teach a case. This is a little bit of a long-winded answer, but I really think that this is the heart of what we're talking about here. I teach a case. It was a real case that was done by my predecessor teaching at Michigan, LaRue Hosmer, where there was a young woman who was working in a department store, and they were selling gourmet food, but some of them had bugs in them, bugs crawling around on top of them. And her manager told him that she needed to sell the cookies to the inner city at a fraction of the cost. Well, there's a lot of problems with that. You're selling tainted food and stuff like that. And so, but from a certain twisted perspective, the manager was doing what she was incented to do because her compensation was based on profitability per square foot of floor space that she controlled. And her annual allocation of square footage was based on the same formula. So all of her financial incentives for her to do exactly what she did. And so while I'm sure that most companies don't want to be known as the bug infested cookie company, but at the same time, that's what their incentives. So is your rhetoric matching the rewards? And so that's another way to orient people to do what you want them to do. And then finally, and we may talk about this a little bit later, is most people, we've already mentioned it, most people want to be good. Most people want to think of themselves as good. Most people want to be ethical, but have you given them the opportunity or the structure or the ways in which they can tap that part of their human dimension? And I think that if you align all those, if you put all of these in play, you don't put them into the side, but you put all these into the play, you're not going to eliminate tension. I mean, there's going to be things that are tough choices that you have to make, but you can start thinking more holistically of, let's find a way to put these together. These are all valuable things we put together. And what I have found very, very frequently is you put them together, you come up with solutions, creative solutions that you never thought of before. It's harder work, but you come up with new paradigms and parallels that you can do that you hadn't thought of before. And so it doesn't eliminate tensions, but it may lead to an entirely new way of an approaching a problem or doing business.
Professor, is there evidence indicating that the virtues identified by executives reflect broader societal values? Or are these priorities unique to the executive viewpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So, yeah, this is actually one of my favorites. So, I've taught for 40 years now, and I've taught 14,000 students at this point. Some of them are just lost. I shouldn't say just law students. I don't want it to mean my law students. Some of them are law students, but most of them are ethics students. And with my ethics classes, so now we're talking about 8 or 9,000 of my students. I start every class of the term with, I say, I want you to tell me what values, what virtues, what practices that you would like to see implemented or practiced in an organization that you are a part of. And they put up a whole bunch on the board. And if I've got 50 people in the classroom, I've got 50 different things that are up on the board. And then, because there's a lot of things that people value, and people value different things. There's a lot of diversity of what we value. But then I give them 7 votes. And I say, okay, which one are the 7 most important ones? It always ends up the same thing. I mean, I can predict going in what the answers are going to be, but I want them to be able to tell me from their voice what they think rather than me telling them what I think that they should do. Even if they agree with me, it's much more powerful if they can speak. It's always the same thing. It's always honesty and accountability, creativity, loyalty, resilience, transparency. I mean, it's all you'll get a little bit of variation when you get around five, six, or seven, but there's some core things that just come up and again and again. And many times business students and business people feel that, everybody has different virtues, so we can never agree on anything. And that there aren't any virtues that people would agree on are going to be part of the workplace. I mean, that's just wrong. I mean, I have seen it thousands of times that people agree on what their values should be. That is true with executives too. When Alexandra and I did this book, our model was we interviewed 20 executives who had a reputation for running ethical organizations. 10 were from Europe, 10 were from North America. And we asked them what they thought their virtues were important virtues. And they're the same ones. And so they didn't disagree with all of my students over 40 years. And not only that, but I was doing an expert witness testimony, which I do a fair amount of. And it was on a case on scientists, some scientific research. And in particular, we were looking at toxicologists and, and identifying dangers in toxicology. And so I was looking at the standards of conducts and the codes of conducts of various toxicologists. And then they said the same thing too. In fact, there was one guy who said, these are our virtues of practicing toxicology, but they apply in every walk of life. And so sometimes I get a little bit, I think it's actually a red herring. I think it's an excuse that some people use to say, well, we can't come up with anything. My experience is exactly the opposite. It's just that if you say you can't come up with anything, then you can get away with whatever you want because you say there's no agreement. There's actually quite a bit of agreement. And so I think that the virtues that executives identify are the same one that both my young 19-year-olds identify, as well as my 30-something MBAs identify, as well as toxicologists identify. It's the same thing over and over again. And so I do think that there is a consensus of the way that one goes about not just ethical business behavior, but life.
Professor, one of your themes is tone at the top. How can leaders set a sincere tone that cascade through middle management and frontline teams rather than staying as a slogan at the executive level?
Yeah, because you're right, it is all too often a slogan. But so a couple things. Number one, when Alexandra and I did the book, I mean, the interviews that we did with the executives, that was the number one thing that they said, that the most important thing to have an ethical organization is have tone at the top. I have to admit that I smile at this because if you ask an executive what's the most important thing, their response basically is we are. And so I kind of got a kick out of that. But it's not untrue either. I mean, I think that they're right. That if you have an executive that's giving a very poor tone from the top, you're probably not going to get much of anywhere. So the question, though, as you rightly put it, is, how does that become more than a slogan or more than PR kinds of things? And I have a couple of thoughts on that. Number one is the amount of energy that they put into making sure that everybody hears that message. It's one thing to put out a press release. It's another thing to have it on a corporate code of conduct or a mission statement that you put on the web. Have you gone to the people in the organization and talked to them about it? I mean, in person, have you been there so that they can touch and feel you and get a sense of that this person is real. They are sincere about this. It's not, and it's different if you're doing it. It's better if you're doing it virtually, but it's even better if you can do it in person. So there's that kind of a component to it. Another one that executives aren't going to like to hear, but if you've got an executive compensation differential that is, 300 times what the average, pay scale is for an individual in the organization of everything. This is an ATM card for the executive, and we just help, provide the funds for the ATM card. And so, I mean, executives don't like to hear that, but if you've got a pretty wide differential, you're going to have a tougher case that you would like to make. There's one other thing that I would mention. Particularly in the US, there's all kinds of these compliance programs out there, and there's a whole legal history of why they exist. Starting in 1991, when the organizational sentencings of the federal sentencing guidelines were applied to companies, and I won't go into the whole legal history. I don't think you probably want to know all that, but there's a long legal history that goes along with it. And so those have been around long enough that people have done studies of what works and what doesn't work when these compliance programs. And the number one things that they have found, these are people like Linda Trevino at Penn State, Gary Weaver at Delaware, Phil Cochran at the Kelley School in Indianapolis, our sister school here at Kelley School. And they said if there's not what they call top-bottom accountability. And what they mean by that is, I mean, everybody knows that the bottom levels of management is accountable to the top. You report to the boss. I mean, we all know that. But are the top levels of management, if not accountable to the bottom, at least accountable to a common set of standards that apply to everybody? And what they show is if that doesn't happen, then you create a lot more cynicism, and tone at the top makes no difference at all. I'll give you two examples of that. One is Enron. Enron had a great code of conduct. They had a provision in the code of conduct that says that if you are an owner, if you're an officer or director of Enron, you cannot own a related entity to Enron. You can look at this if you don't believe, look at the Powers report by William Powers, who was on the independent directors. At the time, he was the dean of the law school at the University of Texas, later became the president of the University of Texas. And he wrote this report, and they said that the CFO at the time wanted to have ownership interest in one of the special purpose entities because it would make him a lot of money. And I won't go into the specifics of how it would, but it would make him a lot of money. But it violates the code of conduct. Well, what are you going to do? You got a code of conduct that says he can't have the money, but he would really like to have the money, and he's a higher up. So they basically just suspended the code of conduct, or waived it for a while, did the deal, and then reinstated it. So they could say we never violated our code of conduct. You just suspended it when it was inconvenient. They did that 3 times. I mean, what kind of a message do you think that that sends? Or I'll give you an even more concrete example. Early on in my career, when I was starting to teach at the University of Michigan, I started teaching their executive education program. And they had a program called the Management of Managers, the MOM program. And the MOM program were about 30 mid-level managers, mostly pulled from the big 3 auto companies because Ann Arbor is just outside of Detroit. And so they had a lot of connections with the auto industry. And I had them for Tuesday night from 7 to 9 p.m. To talk about ethics. And I was talking about this idea that I was sharing before of quality and how to infuse ethics in all your conversation. And I had one guy who went just kind of bananas on this whole thing. And I won't do it because it'll ruin your audio. But you can imagine that he started to slam his fist on the table. He said, I want to know how my people can understand. He's screaming at this point that I mean business. And if they screw up, I'm going to bust their butt and I'm going to get them out of here. And the veins were sticking out of his neck and his face was turning purple. And it was just kind of a weird thing. I said, you know what you can do to make sure that everybody knows that you mean business? Is to make sure that they know that all those principles that you were talking about apply to yourself and not just to them. And he got up and walked right out of the room. And it's exactly what they're talking about. So, I mean, that's not fully at the top, but it's in a an upper level of management. If you apply different standards to yourself that you can get away with as opposed to everybody else, it just undermines everything. So those are kind of just some comments on tone at the top and how you might be able to achieve it.
Professor, you emphasize that ethics should be valued in its own right, not just as a means to profit or reputation. How can boards and investors be persuaded to embrace sincerity as a core value rather than a PR strategy?
So, yeah, that's a fair question too. Um, I think the first answer that I would give is that I have found that many business students and many business leaders feel trapped of what they can and can't do. There are a lot of studies out there, and there are studies of studies. There are meta studies, like my former colleagues at Michigan, Jim Walsh and Joshua Margolis did. That does ethics pay off? Does financial performance pay off? Does it end up being good ethics and being good business? And in the short term, that's a tough sell. In the short term, it's easy to sweep ethics and social performance under the rug and just get the money. That's a tough one. And I think that ethics do a disservice to everybody if they just say, well, yeah, ethics is good business. I go, well, in the short term, I'm sorry, the evidence is pretty shaky on that. I mean, there's some, but it's shaky. But in the long term, it does seem to, if not fully pay off, there's a weak correlation between them. And so you can be ethical and be successful. You can also be unethical and be a jerk and be successful. I mean, that's the thing. It's a choice. So you can be an ass and you can make money. That is true. But you can also choose to do it a different way, and maybe the choices are going to be different, but you can choose to do it. So it does become a choice. And many times I think people think, well, I have to do this. Well, did you do your research before you joined a company so you know what the company is about? I mean, when Alexandra and I, for instance, she came to Indiana University, gosh, it's what, about 5, 6 years ago, as what we call the polling shareholder, which is an outside person that comes in and spends a couple of weeks talking to students. I mean, they've been astronauts, former governors, former Army chief of staff, and so a wide variety of people. And we did a presentation on the book, kind of like what we're doing right now. And it was in front of, undergraduate students, and we got to a Q&A, and they said, are you guys going to write another book together? And we said we'd love to, and we'd still love to. We just haven't gotten around to it given our other schedules and kind of commitments, but we'd love to work together again. But we turned the question back on them. We said, what would you want us to write about? And they said, what we would like to, this is 19-year-old, 20-year-old students are telling us, what we would like to write about is how do we go about finding a company that aligns with our values so that we don't get trapped in an organization where we have to do the kinds of things that we don't want to do. And I think that's a great answer. I thought that that was an inspiring answer. And I think it's something that we don't often do. We spend a lot of time on how you're going to be developed, on your finances, on travel, on all this, and none of all of which are fair enough. But do you really spend time making sure, first of all, what your values are, and second, do they fit in the organization that you're a part of? And so that's one part of it. The other part of it is that there's a there's a temptation to think that businesses are all alike, and they're not. They differ. There are lots of different kinds of businesses. There's certainly a lot of different kinds of small businesses, some of which take this stuff very, very seriously. And even with publicly held companies, where you might have, a million shareholders, even there, I've consulted with companies that have a very, very strong ethical culture strategy. And I've asked them, the CEO, I said, how do you do this? Because aren't your investors banging on the door of we want short-term money? And he said, investors are different. Some investors invest for the short term. We're not a company for them. Other investors believe in a long-term strategy and they see how our strategy can make a difference and it will work for them. But you have to communicate with them a lot of why you're doing what you're doing. But businesses are not monolithic. Investors are not monolithic. And if that is true, then if you are working for a company, you have choices. You have choices of where you are going to work. So yeah, if you're going to choose a company that's a dirty company, you're going to end up with a lot of tough trade-offs. And I don't want to overdo this because sometimes we don't have all the options that we would like to have. I understand that. I've been in that situation before too, where there were times that, this really doesn't fit, but I need a job. I get that. But at the same time, there are choices that we have, the kind of place where we want to spend our work time. And if we really are thinking of what our values are, if we're clear about what our values are, then we spend the time to find companies that match those. A lot of those things end up resolving themselves.
Professor, you end the book with 12 concrete actions to cultivate the sincerity edge. If a listener's company could only start with one or two of those actions tomorrow, which would you prioritize and why?
So I'm going to cheat on you. So I knew you were going to ask me that question. You did give me a heads up that that question might be coming, and so I'm going to cheat. I'm going to pick two, but the first one puts two together, so I'm going to kind of sneak three in as a result of it. So the first answer is a tone at the top that aims for the long term. which summarizes a lot of the stuff that we have already been talking about. I do think tone at the top is crucial. Tone at the top, not just the C-suite kind of a thing, although that's the starting point, but that mid-level manager that I talked about that went storming out of my classroom. So every time that you've got a manager, every time you've got a leader, someone in a leadership position, people are going to look to that person of what are the ways that we are expected to behave. So certainly very tone at the top, very at the top, the tone, and also in the middle. But the other thing is that I was referring here just a little bit ago with the studies. The studies do show that in the long term, there is at least a weak correlation between good ethics and good business, that it tends to pay off, or at least it is a choice that you can make. Again, in the short term, it's a tough one. Although there are some studies out there that will make that argument too. It's still a tough one. But in the long term, because you want to have loyal employees and not a lot of turnover who want to stay and continue to work and be inspired and resilient and believe in the company. And because you would like to have repeat customers that are coming back to you again and again and again. So the way that you treat them makes it, is satisfies them. And so because of stakeholders' satisfaction with the way that you are conducting yourself, in the long term, good, solid, ethical behavior, practicing fair play, being honest, truthful, producing high quality goods and services, those kinds of things, those tend to pay off. So if you've got a tone at the top that aims and that tone is aiming to the long term, you can make a lot of progress. And the executives were telling us to meet that too. I mean, tone at the top was number one, and long term was number three, I believe. Number two actually was putting your money where your mouth is. So if you've got a difficult time, like in the famous 1982 Johnson and Johnson Tylenol recall, I mean, they didn't have to pull Tylenol off the shelves worldwide within the week, but they did because they wanted to live up to their credo and to protect their brand. I'm not, I mean, I have some criticisms of Johnson and Johnson over the years, but I think that they got that one exactly right. And I paid attention to it because the day that this happened, I was actually walking down the street in Chicago, or about ready to walk down the street in Chicago to buy extra strength Tylenol capsules at a Walgreens drugstore in the corner of North Avenue and Wells. My roommate dissuaded me from going there, but I was going there to buy the same product that a flight attendant bought at the same afternoon, the same store, and became one of the victims of Tylenol. So I mean, this was always a very personal thing to me, and I think that they were brilliant in the way that they did that. But that showed people that you were putting your money where your mouth is, that you are managing for the long term. So I would still group with this within tone at the top for the long term. But let me give you a surprise on the other one. So that one is kind of summary of where we all have been. But what got me tenure at Michigan, years ago, which was a fabulous university, just a wonderful university. The only reason I left really was because I had some health issues that cold air in Michigan really couldn't account for. Although as a Notre Dame grad, which is a very fierce rival of Michigan, I cannot stand their football team, but it's a wonderful university. So I just want to say that. The argument that I made was that we develop our moral character. This is an argument from natural law that goes back in philosophy for many, many years. We develop our moral character in what are called mediated institutions. These are fairly small organizations where you have to experience consequences of your action. You mold your behavior and your habits in order to be a good member of that community. I mean, we all know these. That's a fancy sociological term for our family, our neighborhood, our religious organizations, and things like that. So, if you're going to be part of the neighborhood, if you're going to be part of the family, you gotta figure out how to work together. You don't necessarily mean you have to love everybody, but you have to figure out how to work together. And then there's some empirical evidence that shows that the human brain is most comfortable in certain sizes of relationships. And you get above a certain size of relationship, you lose a sense that your actions make a difference. And I won't go into, I mean, I wrote like 3 books on this, so I'm not going to go through all of it, but the basic numbers are 4 to 6, 30, and 150. That you get past each one of those breaking points, it becomes harder to really have a quality relationship within each of those. And the 150 one is something that Robin Dunbar is particularly, and Malcolm Gladwell has picked up on it as well. That if you get at any time in your life, there's about 150 people, as Dunbar colloquially puts it, that if you saw one of them sitting in a bar, you'd feel comfortable pulling up a chair and having a beer with them. I mean, you kind of know them. Or my riff on this is there are 4 to 6 people that had to be at a wedding, the bride, the groom, two witnesses, and the officiant. There are 30 people who the bride and the groom said, it just wouldn't be the wedding unless those people were there. You get 150 people on the invitation list, and the bride and the groom are saying, wouldn't it be cool if they were there? And you get above 150, and the bride and groom are looking at each other and they say, who the hell are they? I mean, these numbers really work. I have had students go out of my class and say, boy, this just breaks down perfectly. Now, what does that have to do with business and business ethics? Well, what it has to do is that if you put people are more likely to act ethically if they recognize that their actions make a difference to someone. Otherwise, if it's just going out into the ether sphere and you don't think it makes a difference, it's hard to say that this is still important. You still could do it, but it's harder. And so I think that organizations creating organizational structures within their corporations that put people in the sizes of organizations that match human beings' neurobiological capabilities will create atmospheres where people are intuitively more ethical because they recognize that their actions make a difference. So the two things I would do is this tone at the top, aiming toward the long term, and then put people, and this is part of our book too, but put people in sizes of organizations that match their neurobiological capability.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question.
Okay.
Looking ahead, where do you see the greatest opportunity and greatest risk for sincerity in business, especially as companies navigating AI, geopolitical crisis, and increasingly vocal stakeholder expectations?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. There's a lot, lot, lot of greatest opportunities and risks there. But I'm going to focus on polarization, which is what I'm currently writing about. And it's why I'm writing about it, because I think it's the biggest thing that we have going on. Because I'll just start here in the US, but I think this has worldwide components to it as well. I mean, there was a survey that was done here 3 weeks ago or something like that, that showed that the US, for the first time, and it is the only country in the world where people think that over half the people in the country are bad. That's astonishing. I mean, it's not that they just disagree or they're wrong-headed on it. They're bad. They're actually bad people. And so, I mean, my current work, you referenced it when you're doing the introduction, is this book that I'm working on with Kristen Hahn. And the idea is that we have to find ways to establish how we have an identity, common ground and identity with those people when we are in conflict with them and that we disagree with them. And our starting points are, and we're talking just baby steps here of what could I share with another person, even if I disagree with them. And so, I mean, there may be things like music, sports, food. Those are all examples of storytelling, film. And so these are all examples of uh, um, uh, cultural artifacts or shared cultural experiences that people find ways to not compromise with each other. That's another step. But just to be able to know that there is something that the other person has that they can identify with so that the next step in the conversation becomes a little bit more constructive and civil. Just to give you an example, those that maybe I'm picking the wrong sport for this, but in America that we have the game softball, which is like baseball, and there was an incident case 10 years ago or so, a women's softball game in the Pacific Northwest. It was somewhat school from Oregon and school of Washington. And there was a young woman who was a senior playing in her last game, Sarah Tukulski, who had never hit a home run in her life. But she hit the ball over the fence and went over the fence. And she started, in order to score the home run, you have to touch each one of the 4 bases, first, second, third, and home. But as she was rounding first base, she tripped and fell and tore her ACL in her knee. So she couldn't move. So she crawled back to first base and couldn't move. And so she couldn't score the home run. And her coaches said to the umpire, well, could we help her around the bases? I mean, clearly she's hurt. There's a reason for this. And the umpire says, no, there's a rule that you cannot assist a teammate around the bases. Whereupon the other team came to the umpire and said, how about if we help her? And the umpire said, there's no rule against that. So the opposing team put Sarah on their shoulders and carried her around the bases, and she would tap each base with her foot. and they scored a run against the people who were helping them, which ended up being the winning runs. And so when I do presentations, I ask my audience, can you imagine metaphorically helping the other side, whoever the other side is, score a run or a point against you and helping them because it was just a good thing to do? And the answer is no. The polarization is too hard. They can't imagine doing that. But then I reframe the question. Could you and a member of the other side watch that incident and both of you agree that was terrific? And every person raises their hand. And that's the kind of a thing that a sporting event, a shared grief, a shared joy, a shared song, a shared film. And I've been doing surveys on this with my students and outside surveys. I've got over 5,000 data points of how this works. This works, but it takes a little bit of a step and a little bit of goodwill to be able to have the conversation of what do we have in common. But once that happens, the tenor of the conversation is really changed. With all those challenges that you just threw at me, Deepak, with all of them that are out there, and there's a lot, and they are serious, and there's things you struggle with, you're never going to get anywhere, I think, if you can't have people have a conversation of how to collectively solve them. And I think that this is a first step to help people find that common identity so they can at least have the conversation of how to solve it. So that would be my number one thing that I look at.
Thank you, Professor Timothy, for sharing your time, insights, and experience with us today. Your reflections have not only deepened our understanding of ethical leadership and sincerity in business, but also have given us a concrete ways to think about our own roles as a responsible professionals. We are truly grateful for your generosity and wisdom, and we look forward to continue learning and collaboration with you in the future. Thank you once again.
Well, thank you very much, Deepak, and I am very honored and pleased that you had me here for today. And I hope that this was in some ways helpful for you and your audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.